Good evening, and shalom. Welcome to this episode here of the Watchdog. I'm your host, CJ Cox, coming at you for the first time in quite a while, actually. At least on this particular program. I've been doing a lot of unapologetics, but I've not been doing a lot of Watchdogs, so my apologies on that. We're not actually going to cover too much of the news today. Nothing that's current, at least. But instead, we are actually going to do a hour-long special here on Antifa. These guys right here, and this is, of course, not the only article we're going to be reading, just in case those of you out here are objecting, oh, he's using a Wikipedia article. Meh. Well, first off, it's just a myth that Wikipedia is a untrustworthy news source. It certainly has issues, like every news source, or not news source, but information source. I'm sorry, I got something on my computer. Anyways, but no, for general information, Wikipedia is usually correct. Not necessarily for in-depth information, but general information, usually correct. Anyways, we're going to be doing some discusserating about Antifa, and about the ideology of Antifa, a little bit of the history of Antifa, a little bit of the violent actions of Antifa, what I personally think about Antifa. For those of you who don't know, which I can't imagine is anybody who would be even remotely interested in this program, Antifa is a organization that is very anti-Trump, very anti-conservative. They consider themselves to be anti-fascist, hence the term Antifa. They're a loose organization. It's not necessarily even accurate to call them an organization per se. It's more of a movement in the sense that there are multiple independent wings of groups that call themselves Antifa. The things that seem to bind them are a very large hatred of conservatism, of anything that would be remotely traditional as far as Western culture and Christianity and the Abrahamic faith and things like that are concerned, and a kind of anarcho-communist ideology. We'll get into a little bit of what anarcho-communism is here as well. They're also militant. That is one of the things that makes Antifa, the direct action as they call it, it's one of the things that makes Antifa distinct from other left-wing organizations. They're very similar to BAM in that regard. And like I said, or when I say organization, that's sort of a misnomer. It's more accurately described as a movement. There are numerous independent organizations, all of which consider themselves to be members of this Antifa movement. You could consider Smash Racism DC, for example, complete scumbags, by the way, to be part of this Antifa movement. There's an Antifa Boise, there's an Antifa Portland, right? There's numerous different Antifa chapters. So, what is Antifa? Well, just a brief little reading here into the Wikipedia page. The Antifa movement is composed of left-wing, autonomous, militant anti-fascist groups and individuals in the United States. The principal feature of Antifa groups is their use of direct action, with conflicts occurring both online and in real life. They engage in varied protest tactics, which include digital activism, property damage, physical violence, and harassment against those whom they identify as fascist, racist, or on the far right. I'm not going to lie, that is actually surprisingly generous of Wikipedia, considering the usual left-wing slant that you see on Wikipedia for them to say those who they identify as, kind of leveling it out a little bit there. But anyways, activists involved in the movement tend to be anti-capitalists and subscribe to a range of ideologies, typically on the left. They include anarchists, socialists, and communists, along with some liberals and social democrats. Their stated focus is on fighting far-right and white supremacist ideologies directly, rather than through electoral means. And I would say that it's even more accurate to describe them as the anarcho-fascists, not as, they do have not anarcho-fascists, sorry, anarcho-socialists. They do have anarchists and socialists and communists, as they are saying here. But you will very quickly see here in this episode that anarcho-socialist is a much more accurate description. It's not so much that all of these separate groups exist in this ideology, but rather they are kind of coming together and kind of reforming an old ideology in this fusion of their beliefs. I'm going to read a little bit further into this particular I don't know if you could call Wikipedia article, are they articles? Like, anyways. We're going to go with article, lack of a better term. When Italian dictator Benito Mussolini consolidated power under his National Fascist Party in the mid-1920s, an oppositional anti-fascist movement surfaced both in Italy and countries such as the United States. Many anti-fascist leaders in the United States were syndicalist, anarchist, and socialist. I don't know how to say that word. I'm going to go emigres. My apologies. From Italy, with experience in labor organizing and militancy. Ideologically, Antifa in America sees itself as the successor to anti-Nazi activists of the 1930s. European activist groups that originally organized to oppose World War II-era fascist dictatorships re-emerged in the 1970s and 80s to oppose white supremacy and skinheads, and eventually spread to America. After World War II, but prior to the development of the modern Antifa movement, violent confrontations with fascist elements continued sporadically. And there is something to be said here about, and once again, this is very generous considering what most news organizations will say about Antifa and what the bias that Wikipedia actually usually presents itself. Although Wikipedia, of course, is not a news organization. In that there is definitely a distinction between different Antifa movements, certainly. Like, there was an Antifa movement from Italy, from Germany, from Britain, right? And they were even sort of separate in their own little ways. But there is also a new, modern kind of Antifa movement that is unique in a very real sense. One of the most real senses that it is unique in is that it is not actually a reaction to any sort of a fascist dictatorship or anything like that. A lot of people like to say that it is a reaction to things like Donald Trump and things like that, but as we're going to quickly see here in this episode, that is not actually the case. Antifa started becoming very popular, very powerful, and this, not just Antifa, because Antifa itself, as far as the direct action they were directly taking, was definitely a result of the presidency, but the ideology that they were following and espousing was starting to gain traction. Although, I mean, as far back really as like we're even seeing here, they say the 80s, but we started seeing some pretty interesting left-wing protests as far back as 2010 and 11, as far as being very debaucherous and violent, right? With the Occupy protests, for example, with the eco-terrorists of the early 2000s, right? Obviously, there was, as far back even as the 1960s, guys like Weather Underground. Now, I don't think that these are the direct successors to Weather Underground, don't get me wrong, but there has been sort of this build-up of a anarcho-communist left-wing sentiment in the United States and other Western countries that I think is kind of caused this boiling over effect of the really insane political process that we're currently, or political climate, rather, that we're currently in, which, of course, includes Antifa, which is a militant wing of it. Modern Antifa politics can be traced to opposition to the infiltration of British punk scene by white power skinheads in the 1970s and 80s, and the emergence of neo-Nazism in Germany following the fall of the Berlin Wall. In Germany, young leftists, including anarchists and punk fans, renewed the practice of street-level anti-fascism. Columnist Peter Beinart writes that in the late 80s, left-wing... I cannot talk right now, I am so sorry. Left-wing punk fans in the United States began following suit, though they initially called their groups Anti-Racist Action, or ARA, on the theory that Americans would be more familiar with fighting racism than they would be with fighting fascism. Dartmouth College historian Mark Bray, author of Antifa, the Anti-Fascist Handbook, credits ARA as the precursor of the modern U.S. Antifa groups in the United States and Canada. In the late 1980s and 1990s, ARA activists toured with popular punk rock and skinhead bands in order to prevent Klansmen, neo-Nazis, and other assorted white supremacists from recruiting. Their motto was, "We go where they go," by which they meant they would confront far-right activists in concerts and actively remove their materials from public places. In 2002, the ARA disrupted a speech in Pennsylvania by Matthew F. Hale, the head of the white supremacist group World Church of the Creator, resulting in a fight and 25 arrests. One of the earliest Antifa groups in the U.S. was Rose City Antifa, which was formed in Portland, Oregon in 2007. Other Antifa groups in the U.S. have other genealogies. For example, in Minneapolis, Minnesota, where a group called the Baldies was formed in 1987 with the intent to fight neo-Nazi groups directly. The English word Antifa is a loan word from German, taken from the abbreviation of the Antifaschistisch. Don't speak any German. Please don't hold that against me. Anti-fascist is what it means in proper English speak. That's a joke, by the way. And the name of that particular group, which I assume means anti-fascist action. Oxford Dictionaries, which placed Antifa on a short list of Word of the Year in 2017, said it emerged from relative obscurity to become an established part of the English lexicon over 2017. Anti-Defamation League makes a point that the label Antifa should be limited to those who proactively seek physical confrontations with their perceived fascist adversaries, and I actually surprisingly need to agree with the ADL in that there are definitely people who are anarcho-socialist and also just anarchist and socialist by themselves who are not completely insane in the violent sense. I think it's pretty clear that, for example, Tim Pool or Joe Rogan, right, people who are definitely very left-wing in their politics, well, they're not our enemies in this sense. I mean, they're not even really enemies, right? They're adversaries in a political sense, maybe, perhaps in a different time, but they're not enemies. We don't, like, dislike each other in a sense that we're going to have, violent confrontations with each other. There's other description of stuff here. You can actually see the rest of this in the description where it talks about their ideology according to this Wikipedia page, of course. The reason we're not going to read this is mainly because I think there is other articles here that are going to better explain that. This was sort of just, like I said, Wikipedia is sort of a good general overview. Here we have a pretty in-depth article by a man by the name of Matthew Vadum. This is on capitalistresearch.org. No, capitalresearch.org, sorry. Although wouldn't it be ironic if it was capitalistresearch.org? Anyways, though, this is a pretty in-depth article into the history of Antifa and their ideology. It's called Origins of Antifa. Briefly, what is Antifa and why should anyone care about it? I think it does a much better job than the Wikipedia article does. But like I said, the Wikipedia article will be in the description. You can read it for yourself and let me know in the comment section whether or not you disagree. The left's explosive, prolonged rage at the election of President Donald Trump on November 8, 2016 gave new life to the ultra-violent leftist movement known as Antifa. As a result, Antifa, which has been described as a revolutionary, communist, anarchist militia movement that aspires to forcibly overthrow the United States government, is responsible for a level of sustained political street warfare not seen in the U.S. since the 1960s. Now, bear in mind what he is saying here. This is certainly charged language when he says political street warfare, but it is accurate in the sense that there is a lot of violence between right groups and Antifa groups. Notice, though, he compares it not to something like the 1870s or the 1860s, which would be even worse, right? But to something back to like the 1960s, right? Where it's like this was definitely happening. It didn't quite manifest in a way that you might have thought it would at the time. By which I mean a serious conflict, civil war, terrorist groups fighting each other, and etc. Which we'll get into what I think about that in a moment. But just know that though this is politically charged language, certainly it is not inaccurate. Right, this is definitely something that we did see in the 1960s with the different civil rights groups, Weather Underground, of course, and certain hippie groups were definitely not as hippie as they would like you to believe, although not all of them. Definitely a lot of the hippie groups were peaceful, the majority of them, let's be perfectly clear, right? At any rate, reports of Antifa violence are everywhere, which is why the U.S. Department of Homeland Security has quietly designated Antifa as a domestic terrorist. Domestic terrorists, rather. Capital Research Center produced a 3-part documentary series, America Under Siege, about Antifa and other political actors, which is a phenomenal documentary, by the way. I would definitely recommend you check it out. Antifa is not a single organization. It is a movement or coalition of leftist groups, each of which claims to combat fascism, a political ideology whose definition academics have been arguing about for decades. The word Antifa itself is a truncation, really need to get better at words, of anti-fascist. Despite the name, the movement embraces fascistic tactics. Antifa has gained new prominence in the post-Obama era. They traced their roots back to Nazi Germany. Although they opposed that word, Sturmad blah 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 blah, Like I said, don't speak German. Don't hold it against me. I'll go ahead and, highlight it for you. You guys can read it for yourselves and then mock me about how little I know about the German language in the comment section down below. I really don't mind it. SA, or Nazi stormtroopers. So although they opposed the Nazi stormtroopers, like the SA, they also used violence to intimidate political opponents and break up their meetings and rallies. It could be argued that the ideological distance between Antifa and the now defunct National Socialist German Workers' Party, which it has the full German name there, abbreviated NSDAP, or Nazi Party, is so slight, it can be measured in millimeters. Excuse me again. Determining who funds Antifa is difficult because the movement is highly decentralized and consists of private individuals and loosely affiliated groups. Journalist Lee Stranahan downplays the significance of funding to Antifa, quote, while it's been proven that funders like Soros and the Democrat Party have paid protest organizers and some protesters groups like the violent Black Bloc, Black Bloc refers to a set of tactics, not a group. Groups like the violent Black Bloc typically aren't motivated by money, but instead come to protest because of their anti-American ideology, base criminal desires, and thrill-seeking. Nonetheless, the left-wing billionaire George Soros has ties to Antifa through a group called the Alliance for Global Justice. Soros Philanthropy, known at the time as the Open Society Institute, gave $100,000 to the AFGJ, $50,000 in 2004, and $50,000 in 2006. Acting as a fiscal sponsor, AFGJ gave $50,000 to Refuse Fascism, an unincorporated Antifa group. Fiscal sponsors are recognized tax-exempt 501c3 nonprofits that take in donations on behalf of unincorporated or small groups so that donors can deduct the donations from their taxes, charging the group receiving the donations a processing fee. Man, I have got to get better at reading. Refuse Fascism was created in the weeks after Donald Trump's unexpected victory over Hillary Clinton in the 2016 presidential election. The group's goal was summed up in its slogan on its website, quote, "It's fascism, drive out the Trump-Pence regime," end quote. Refuse Fascism participated in rioting on February 1st, 2017 at the University of California, Berkeley, with the goal of preventing controversialists, that's an interesting word, Milo Yiannopoulos from giving a speech. The rioting caused more than $500,000 in damage. Stopping someone from speaking is called no-platforming or sometimes deplatforming, summoning the spirit of repressive tolerance. Essayist Herbert Marcuse, the so-called father of the New Left, who favored shutting down non-leftists, Antifa and others on the far left believe that fascists are not entitled to free speech. But Antifa operates under a twisted definition of fascism, labeling mainstream conservative fascists and lumping them in with white supremacists and neo-Nazis. Except in the fantasies of Antifa and radical hate groups like the Southern Poverty Law Center, it is fair to say that the true fascists are hard to find in the USA today. Nevertheless, Antifa supporters are finding fascists where they don't exist. Radical journalist Natasha Leonard wrote on The Nation on the eve of Inauguration Day 2017 that Donald Trump is a living, breathing example of a fascist. Quote, "To call Trumpism fascist is to suggest that it demands from us a unique response. We can deploy the fascism moniker to Trump's ascendance by recognizing features like selective populism, nationalism, racism, traditionalism, the deployment of newspeak, and disregard for reasoned debate. The reason we should use the term is because, taken together, these aspects of Trumpism are not well combated or contained by standard liberal appeals to reason. If constitutive of its fascism, that it demands a different sort of opposition. If it is constitutive of its fascism, rather, then it demands a different sort of opposition," end quote. By the way, just a quick side note, as a firm opposer of what could accurately be described as Trumpism, I think it is definitely not the case that Trumpism is fascism. Trumpism is certainly a nationalistic and populistic ideology for certain. I don't think it's accurate to call it traditionalism at all. I mean, that is just way far from the truth. And saying the deployment of newspeak and disregard for reasoned debate, definitely not any more so than anybody else in the political spectrum. Also, the racism moniker is something that I find to be ridiculous as well. That being said, there is a certain level of truth to be said about a populist, nationalist flavor to Trumpism, though that is not, I think, the main issue with it. Nonetheless, moving on from where I actually agree with these losers. So is Manhattan Institute scholar Heather MacDonald, allegedly because she is pro-police. In April 2017, Antifa prevented MacDonald from from entering an auditorium at Claremont McKenna College where she was supposed to deliver a speech. Bizarrely, the activists called her a fascist, a white supremacist, a war hawk, a transphobe, a queerphobe, and a classist who was ignorant of interlocking systems of domination that produced the lethal conditions under which oppressed peoples are forced to live. Mouthful, I know. All because she has written books about how police are not racist. Meanwhile, here are just a few examples of Antifa violence from 2017. On March 4th, hundreds of Antifa activists descended on Berkeley to use violence to disrupt a March for Trump rally. At least 10 protesters were arrested. The same day, Woody Kane, son of Senator Tim Kaine, was part of an Antifa assault on Trump supporters in the rotunda of the Minnesota Capitol. Kane fought with police as they tried to arrest him for lobbying a smoke bomb. Yeah, that's the same Tim Kaine who had his, who was the vice presidential candidate for Hillary Clinton, by the way. On March 25th, Antifa launched a counter-protest at a pro-Trump event in Philadelphia. They chanted, quote, "Anytime, any place, punch a Nazi in the face," end quote, and forced the cancellation of the rally. Antifa hurled bricks at Trump supporters during a march in Portland, Oregon on June 4th. Police relied on tear gas and stun grenades to disperse the mob. On August 19th, quote, when a few dozen people held a free speech rally in Boston, some 40,000 anti-fascist protesters gathered a stage to counter demonstration, end quote, according to a report. Quote, all told, there were 33 arrests, mostly for disorderly conduct and assaults on police officers, end quote. The same month in Berkeley, Antifa protested President Trump's proposed border wall and the very existence of America, quote, no Trump, no wall, no USA at all, they chanted. We've, of course, all seen this before. The Antifa website, itsgoingdown.org, states that, quote, in the U.S., most anti-fascist activists are anarchist, although a few are Maoist or anti-state Marxist. But in other countries, the movement is predominantly Marxist. Antifa views America as those who safeguard its free institutions as fundamentally illegitimate. Itsgoingdown.org advises activists to, quote, build a culture of non-cooperation with law enforcement, and, quote, if you have any intention of working with the police, FBI, or other agencies, end quote, it continues, or if you, not end quote, sorry, it continues, or if you publicly condemn anti-fascists who break the law, don't call yourself an anti-fascist. Itsgoingdown.org has urged activists to make the country ungovernable by participating in mass insurrection, mass resistance, and all manner of physical violence against Trump supporters, capitalists, and, quote, conservative fascists. The website displayed propaganda images of violent attacks on persons wearing Trump campaign hats, bearing the slogan, Make America Great Again. This kind of violence was a necessary evil to promote social justice and destroy fascism. Because of the rise of Antifa and the current political climate, CRC is launching a rolling expose on the movement in a series designed, man, I swear I know the English language, I promise you. In a series designed to grow into a separate website, CRC will examine in more detail and origin the history of Antifa, the ideology behind the movement, Antifa's leaders, and sympathizers, sources of funding, and common coalition partner groups. The expose will include databases to make it easier for readers to track members, events, and even victims. And if you guys are interested, this will be in the description. There's a little bit about the article here. As you can see, these guys have a history of being anti-Trump. Now, the reason I wanted to read this instead of the ideology thing that we see in Wikipedia is because there will be this constant talk about how they're allegedly anti-fascist and anti-white supremacist and all that kind of stuff, but what we need to understand is what they are is anti-Trumpist and anti-conservative, okay? Which are two different things, just for the record. When I say they are anti-Trumpist, I mean they are against the political ideology espoused by Trump and his supporters. I think that should be perfectly clear, but just in case anybody is questioning of that. Now, I don't think they necessarily all know what that ideology is, but I think that they at least know they don't like Trump and his supporters. That's definitely something that would unite them in that regard. They certainly know that they are against conservatism. They don't like the idea of traditionalist marriage. They don't like the idea of the traditionalist family. They don't like the idea of having guns, for example. They seem to be very much against any sort of notion of hierarchy in a traditional way or classism in a traditional way, which is traditionally a conservative belief. They tend to be anti-military and etc. Right? Now, I, of course, have said numerous times in this and numerous times before that I believe they and the modern left and Bernie Sanders and all of these people are what we can refer to as an anarcho-communist. Now we're going to go ahead and look at a brief overview here of what anarcho-communism is. As you can see, they do share the same colors as Antifa, the red and black. Anarcho-communism, also referred to as anarchist communism, communist anarchism, free communism, and libertarian communism, which is an oxymoron if I've ever heard one. Of course, all of these are, though, is a political philosophy and anarchist school of thought which advocates the abolition of the state, capitalism, wage labor, and private property, while retaining respect for personal property along with collectively owned items, goods, and services, in favor of common ownership of the means of production, direct democracy, and a horizontal network of workers' councils with production and consumption based on the guiding principle, from each according to his ability to each according to his need. Some forms of anarcho-communism, such as insurrectionary anarchism, are strongly influenced by egoism and radical individualism, believing anarcho-communism to be the best social system for the realization of individual freedom. Most anarcho-communists view anarcho-communism as a way of reconciling the opposition between the individual and society. Anarcho-communism developed out of the radical socialist currents after the French Revolution, but it was first formulated as such in the Italian section of the First International. The theoretical work of Peter Kropotkin. Anyways, the theoretical work of Peter Kropotkin took importance later as it expanded and developed pro-organizationalist and insurrectionary anti-organizationalist sections. To date, the best-known example of an anarcho-communist society established around the ideas as they exist today and achieving worldwide attention and knowledge in the historical canon are the anarchist territories during the Spanish Revolution and the Free territory during the Russian Revolution, where anarchists such as Nesto Makhno, worked to create and defend anarcho-communism through the revolutionary insurrectionary army of Ukraine from 1919 before being conquered by the Bolsheviks in 1921. Whopping 2 years. Very successful, I know. Through the efforts and influence of the Spanish anarchists during the Spanish Revolution and the Spanish Civil War starting in 1936, anarcho-communism existed in most of Aragon, parts of the Levantine, and Andalusia, as well as in the stronghold of anarchist Catalonia, before being crushed by the combined forces of the Francoist nationalists, the regime that won the war. Nationalist allies such as Adolf Hitler and Benito Mussolini, and even Spanish Communist Party repression backed by the Soviet Union, as well as economic and armaments blockades from the capitalist states and Spanish Republic itself, governed by the Republicans. It's saying that it was crushed by all of those things, right? Being crushed by the Franco-nationalists, the nationalist allies, capitalist states, and etc. And you can kind of see up here where we would get this idea, right? If you look at their sort of brief overview of this philosophy, right? They want an abolition of the state, capitalism, wage labor, and private property. That's certainly something that we see amongst the modern left today. They want some direct democracy, which is certainly something we see amongst the far left today. They want this idea of workers' councils in labor unions and etc., which is certainly something that we see amongst the modern left today. And if you actually go deeper into the ideology, which we're certainly going to look a little bit into it here today, there is other very obvious examples. For example, anti-religious sentiment, free love, radical feminist sentiment, and a bunch of other things that definitely do show here that this is what the modern rendition of the left and Antifa as its violent wing is. It does give a little bit of the history here. I'm going to, again, put this all in the description so that you can read it for yourself. But this is the guy we really want to get to and further. Peter Kropotkin, often seen as the most important theorist of anarchist communism, outlined his his economic ideas in the conquest of bread and fields, factories, and workshops. Kropotkin, however you say it, felt that cooperation is more beneficial than competition, arguing in his major scientific work, Mutual Aid, a Factor of Evolution, that this was well illustrated in nature. He advocated the abolition of private property while retaining respect for personal property through the, quote, expropriation of the whole of social wealth, end quote, by the people themselves, which, of course, that is no different than Marx himself saying that we should spread the wealth amongst everybody, and etc. For the economy to be coordinated through a horizontal network of voluntary associations where goods are distributed according to the physical needs of the individual rather than according to labor. He further argued that these needs, as society progressed, would not merely be physical needs, but, quote, as soon as his material wants are satisfied, other needs of an artistic character will thrust themselves forward the more ardently. Aims of life vary with each and every individual, and the more society is civilized, the more will individuality be developed, and the more will desires be varied, end quote. I'm going to go ahead and say that again because I did so bad at it. Quote, as soon as his material wants are satisfied, other needs of an artistic character will thrust themselves forward. Come on, man. Will thrust themselves forward the more ardently. Aims of life vary with each and every individual, and the more society is civilized, the more will individuality be developed, and more will desires be varied, end quote. And the reason that this is such an important thing to discuss here is because you can definitely see this sentiment is the primary sentiment that drives anarcho-communism both back then and today. And actually, in a very real sense, anarcho-communists are the more authentic Marxists, in that this was Karl Marx's own idea. That once the needs of everybody were to be met, then eventually we could meet the needs of one's mind and creativity, right? The kinds of things that would keep them occupied as far as their artistic wants and whatnot. If you actually were to go look at any of the, quote, social democratic or democratic socialism, which is allegedly the same thing, even though they just switched the words, but whatever, and anything like that, this is the exact same sentiment that they're going to say, is that once we meet everybody's physical needs, we can basically start to meet everybody's emotional needs, and then we'll all live in this great utopia where everybody's able to live the life exactly that they want to, and yet they also don't have any issue as far as wanting for food, wanting for water, wanting for luxury even, wanting for medicine and housing and etc. And this is definitely the primary driving factor behind Kropotkin's ideology and behind the anti-fascist ideology that we currently see and the anarcho-communist ideology that we currently see. And once again, all of this, there's Peter Kropotkin right there, all of this is going to be in the comment section below. We are kind of skimming through it because we do have to get to two other aspects. Another person that we definitely really want to get to here, if I can find her. Oh man, does she not come up in this history? Well, that's no fun. Yeah. There's a little boy toy, Alexander Berkman. So, interesting. I don't know how you would consider, whatever. Just one moment, guys. She was supposed to be there. I don't know why she wasn't. She definitely is an anarcho-communist thinker, but I guess people disagree with me on that. That's fine. Let's go ahead and go down here to her philosophy, specifically tactical uses of violence. This is one of the big aspects of her ideology here. Goldman in her political youth held targeted violence to be a legitimate means of revolutionary struggle. Goldman at the time believed that use of violence, while distasteful, could be justified in relation to the social benefits it might accrue. She advocated propaganda of the deed, or violence carried out to encourage the masses to revolt. She supported her partner Alexander Berkman's attempts to kill industrialist Henry Clay Frick, and even begged him to allow her to participate. She believed that Frick's actions during the Homestead strike were reprehensible, and that his murder would produce a positive result for working people. To be fair, Henry Clay Frick was definitely not a good person, so there's a little bit of truth to the dislike of him, certainly. Yes, she wrote later in her autobiography, the end of this case is justified. The end in this case justified the means. While she never gave explicit approval of Leon, whatever his last name is, assassination of U.S. President William McKinley, she defended his ideals and believed actions like his, were a natural consequence of reprehensive institutions. As she wrote in, quote, Man, I read a little bit too into this sometimes. As she wrote in The Psychology of Political Violence, quote, "The accumulated forces in our social and economic life, culminating in an act of violence, are similar to the terrors of the atmosphere manifested in storm and lightning," end quote. Her experiences in Russia led her to qualify her earlier belief that revolutionary ends might justify violent means. In the afterword to My Disillusionment in Russia, she wrote, quote, "There is no greater fallacy than the belief that aims and purposes are one thing while methods and tactics are another. The means employed become, through individual habit and social practice, part and parcel of the final purpose," end quote. In the same chapter, however, Goldman affirmed that revolution is indeed a violent process and noted that violence was the tragic inevitability of revolutionary upheavals. Some misinterpreted her comments on the Bolshevik terror as a rejection of all militant force, but Goldman corrected this in the preface to her first U.S. edition of My Disillusionment in Russia. Quote, "The argument that destruction and terror are part of revolution I do not dispute. I know that in the past every great political and social change necessitated violence. Black slavery might still be a legalized institution in the United States, but for the militant spirit of the John Browns. I have never denied that violence is inevitable, nor do I gainsay it now. Yet it is one thing to employ violence in combat as a means of defense. It is quite another thing to make a principle of terrorism, to institutionalize it, to assign it the most vital piece in the social struggle. Such terrorism begets counter-revolution, and in turn itself becomes counter-revolutionary," end quote. Goldman saw the militarization of the Soviet Union not as a result of armed resistance per se, but of the statist vision of the Bolsheviks, writing that, quote, "An insignificant minority bent on creating an absolute state is necessarily driven to oppression and terrorism." And we see, especially in her earlier sentiment, that this is something definitely that has been adopted by people in modern Antifa. Whether or not they actually know it, I'm not 100% sure, but it is certainly this philosophy of propaganda of the deed that was definitely a big part of Emma Goldman's philosophy. And if you take Emma Goldman and Peter Kropotkin, and definitely a few others, I think Bill Ayers is certainly very responsible for a lot of the ideology here. Surprisingly, a lot of feminism is actually responsible for a lot of the ideology in Antifa in the modern day. And feminists can be anything in the modern day, from people like Camille Paglia to people like Nina Hartley to people like Amber Rose, right, to some of the more like traditional Susan B. Anthony types, and etc. It's a very interesting thing, actually. But nonetheless, you can kind of see, right, why I would associate not only Antifa as the violent wing, but really the entire young, radical, modern left with this anarcho-communist ideology. But I do want to go into a little bit more here today. So we know what Antifa is, right? We know their brief history here. Why should we care? Well, as already kind of discussed in one of the articles here, Antifa has a history of violence, you see. Antifa is sort of become the radical manifestation of everything that the left has really always wanted. And you're starting to see a lot of people who are on the left kind of realize this, and as a result, they are leaving the left, right? What an ideology itself is wanting as a whole is not necessarily what the sum of all of its, or is not necessarily what each individual in all of its parts wants, right? And I think that's why you see a lot of people like Joe Rogan, for example, was a leftist who definitely is not. Sam Harris, Michael Shermer, right? You see Bill Maher, you see, I mean, just etc. You go down the list, right? There's tons of people. And I think the reason you kind of saw a little bit of the hemorrhage there is because you are seeing that this has sort of been the push of the ideology since the beginning. And I think this is the natural kind of destruction of what was once a virtuous society. I think always the virtuous society creates prosperity because they end up treating their fellow man with dignity. They end up trying to make sure everybody's free. Everybody's got, 3 hots and a cot, and maybe they want to make those 3 hots and a cot delicious and comfortable. And so they decide, let's get some bigger houses. Let's make sure that we have a strong army to protect ourselves. Let's educate our kids, all this kind of stuff. And the virtuous tend to create strong and, virtuous, obviously, societies, right? Societies that have strong family bonds, societies that have strong respect for the traditions, for the freedoms of individuals, and etc. And when you have these prosperous societies that come as a result of these virtuous people, you end up getting spoiled rotten brats, essentially, right? And you end up getting people who start to throw off the traditions and who start to throw off the religion, throw off the traditional political process, throw off the family unit, right, and etc. And they start to adopt more and more radical ideas, right? And of course, the opposite of this can happen as well when you have societies that are already in a radical liberal fashion. And basically what you end up seeing here is you have these people who, on one end, they want all of their personal wants and needs to be met, right? They want to have, because they've been accustomed to it, basically, they want to have their 3 hots and a cot and make it comfortable and luxurious and delicious and all that other kind of stuff. They want to have their Netflix. They want to be able to go get their Starbucks and go to college and not have to pay for that college, and get a car and be able to pay for the gas in that car. But then they also, on this end, right, so because all of this is state stuff, right, they also on this end want to have their freedom of their own sexual practice, want to have freedom to choose their own gender, for an example, want to have the ability to have their crass TV shows with little to no input from a government organization like the FCC, which of course ends up turning back on itself because they end up getting violent in response to conservatives who disagree with them. But of course, when you have two inherently contradictory ideologies, right, this communist ideology, this anarchist ideology, they're going to come into conflict. Of course, you're going to come into conflict with your enemies in a hypocritical fashion. You within yourself have conflict in a hypocritical fashion, right? But nonetheless, we do see that Antifa is actually perpetrating violence quite frequently. Quite frequently indeed. ICE detention center attacker killed by police was an avowed anarchist, authorities say. This is according to the Washington Post, right? Just to make sure that, there's conspiracy theories and all that. No. This is Antifa terrorism. This is what we're dealing with right now. And it's the inevitable result of these leftist ideologies, in my opinion. A man fatally shot by police Saturday after allegedly throwing incendiary objects at an immigration detention center in Washington state was an anarchist, who claimed association with anti-fascists known as Antifa, according to new details released by police. This is July 19th of this year. Detectives are reviewing a manifesto written and distributed by 69-year-old Willem Van Spronsen, who police said once belonged to the Puget Sound John Brown Gun Club, a self-proclaimed anti-fascist, anti-racist, pro-worker organization. Officers were not aware of the manifesto before the attack on the Northwest Detention Center in Tacoma, police said in a statement Thursday. Van Spronsen of Washington... hang on. Okay, that's a good thing that's muted, but still want this to go away. Van Spronsen of Washington's Vashon Island was also embroiled in a custody dispute with his ex-wife when he allegedly tried to blow up the privately owned detention facility, according to police. He was arrested last year at a protest at the center, court records show. Van Spronsen allegedly approached the center around 4 a.m. Saturday, manipulating what looked like an AR-15 style rifle and setting fire to a building owned by the detention center. Police said surveillance video shows he placed flares strategically, including underneath a 500-gallon propane tank, ignited his own car so that it would explode, and threw a Molotov cocktail at nearby buildings. As sirens signaled officers were headed to the center, where a peaceful protest had occurred 8 hours earlier, police said Van Spronsen continued attacking the complex. He pointed a rifle at the 4 officers who arrived, police said, and refused orders to drop the gun. The officers fired at Van Spronsen, hitting him twice and killing him, according to police. Tacoma police identified the officers at the scene as Sergeant C. Martin, Officer J. Correa, Officer C. Allman, and Officer W. Gustafson, although police did not specify which officers fired their weapons. The officers were not injured, and, quote, medical aid was staged, end quote, nearby, according to police. The officers with experience on the Tacoma's police force ranging from 9 months to 20 years have been put on paid administrative leave, according to department policy, which is just department policy after you shoot people for a lot of departments. Police Chief Don Ramsdell praised the officers' actions as honorable and courageous. Quote, because of our officers' selfless commitment to protect and serve, countless lives were potentially saved, including the lives of employees as well as detainees of the Northwest Detention Facility, end quote, Ramsdell said in a statement. Police said that they were continuing to investigate the incident and that citizens and police employees would conduct an internal review after the investigation is complete. Quote, this could have resulted in the mass murder of staff and detainees housed at the facility had he been successful at setting the tank ablaze, end quote. Sean Falla, who heads U.S. Immigration and Customs Enforcement's office, quote, of professional responsibility, said in a statement. Man, that is a long title. U.S. Immigration and Customs Enforcement's Office of Professional Responsibility, said in a statement. These are the kinds of incidents that keep you up at night, she then says. And of course, this is not the other one. You can read the rest of this article for yourself, but we're going to move on to other ones because we have limited time, right? We saw Antifa, of course, making some of its more ridiculous claims, like calling a black man who has de-radicalized KKK members a white supremacist, right? And that's certainly interesting. Here's another one of actual violence that we'll get a little bit into, right? Ex-professor accused of hitting Trump supporters with a bike lock at free speech rally in Berkeley, and he got probation for it. Well, actually, let's go ahead and watch this brief video here. It's only 33
Stay caught up on what's going on in California because at least 20 people are behind bars this morning after violent clashes erupt between two groups of protesters in Berkeley. As you can see, police arriving in riot gear as the far-right No to Marxism rally was countered by the far left Stop the Hate rally. Dozens of weapons, including rocks and poles, were confiscated. 3 people suffered injuries after some type of explosives were thrown. No officers were hurt.
So, a little bit of that background there. A former community college professor and anti-fascist activist, as part of a plea agreement, pleaded to no contest to misdemeanor assault for allegedly hitting supporters of President Trump with a bike lock at a political rally in Berkeley last year. Eric Clanton, 29, agreed to the deal on Wednesday in the Alameda County Superior Court. His attorney, Daniel Siegel, said he was sentenced to 3 years of probation, which will end on August 8, 2021, BerkeleySide.com reported. The Alameda County District Attorney's Office initially charged Clanton, with felonies for hitting several pro-Trump demonstrators on the head with a bicycle lock during the Free the Speech demonstration in Civic Center Park in Berkeley, April 15th, 2017. The attack was captured on camera and posted on YouTube. Siegel said medical records showed only one alleged victim sought medical treatment for a bruise smaller than a dime. Last year, police searched Clanton's apartment and seized flags, pamphlets, and other paraphernalia associated with anarchist and Antifa and anarchist movements. He was arrested following the search, BerkeleySide.com reported. Investigators said they, quote, recovered U-locks, sunglasses of gloves, jeans, and facial coverings consistent with items worn during the April 15th assault, end quote, the website reported, citing court documents. A camera at the residence also contained selfies taken by Clanton, which showed him wearing black clothing and facial coverings similar to the person in the YouTube video. Phone records also showed Clanton was near the park on April 15th, 2017. The police also found photos of Clanton posing next to anarchy symbols, and he was documented as having an iron front tattoo, which is associated with anti-fascists, court documents stated. Clanton taught at the Diablo Valley College in 2015 and 16. He has been arrested in connection with other demonstrations, police said, and he was arrested in 2014 during a Black Lives Matter protest on suspicion of committing a public nuisance and willfully and maliciously blocking a street, sidewalk, or other public places, police said. Excuse me. But we're still not done, because you see, not only do you have a attempted bombing of ICE, and not only do you have this beating here of protesters, but you also have a shooting in Dayton. Dayton shooter Connor Betts may be Antifa's first mass killer. This is according to the New York Post. By the way, this gentleman, Andy, I don't know if that's Nego or Go, or No. I'm not entirely sure how you pronounce his last name. I'm going to go with Go. But nonetheless, well, let's see. Actually, it's Win. So maybe it's I don't know. I have no idea how to pronounce his last name, I'm going to be honest. But nonetheless, we're going to get a little bit into him as well, because that's another instance of Antifa violence. Over the weekend, America suffered 2 mass shootings within hours of one another in El Paso, Texas, and in Dayton, Ohio. These followed another mass shooting in Gilroy, California, a week earlier. The alleged perpetrators of the attacks were young, lone wolf gunmen. All 3 carried out carnage against innocents using high-power rifles. All told, Santino Ligon, well, actually, doesn't matter. The names don't matter. Killed 34 people and injured dozens more. I actually kind of wish he would not mention their names. Their names are not important. But at any rate, that's his choice. While the attacks are similar, the response from liberals and leftists has been anything but. Excuse me. Democratic presidential candidates Joe Biden, Elizabeth Warren, Kamala Harris, and Bernie Sanders succinctly condemned white nationalism, the ideology espoused by the El Paso shooter, in his purported 2,300-word manifesto. However, when it comes to condemning the Dayton shooter's militant far-left views, all remain mum. Others, such as anti-police activist Sean King, even claim the Dayton shooter targeted blacks in a hate crime, though racism doesn't appear to have been a component of his twisted worldview. While the Dayton shooter didn't leave behind a manifesto, his extensive social media footprint provides clues as to what may have inspired him. Federal investigators announced Tuesday that they are looking into his exploration of violent ideologies. He has long expressed support for Antifa accounts, causes, and individuals. That would be the loose network of militant leftist activists who physically attack anyone to the right of Mao in the name of anti-fascism. In particular, he promoted extreme hatred of American border enforcement. Kill every fascist, the shooter declared in 2018 on Twitter, echoing a rallying cry of Antifa ideologues. Over the next year, his tweets became increasingly violent. Nazis deserve death and nothing else. He tweeted last October, he tweeted that last October, he also frequently flung the label Nazi at those with whom he disagreed online. By December, he reached out to Twitter to the Socialist Rifle Association, an Antifa gun group, to comment about bump stocks, and the SRA responded to him. A bump stock is an attachment for semi-automatic rifles that allow them to fire much faster. In the months leading to his rampage, he expressed a longing for climatic confrontations in response to an essay by Intercept writer Mehdi Hassan titled, "Yes, Let's Defeat or Impeach Trump, but what if he doesn't leave the White House?" the shooter wrote. Arm, train, and prepare. By June, he tweeted, "I want socialism, and I'll not wait for the idiots to finally come round to understanding." Last week, he promoted posts that demonized Senators Ted Cruz and Bill Cassidy's resolution against Antifa's extremism. America's historical and contemporary struggles with fringe far-right violence has provided politicians, leaders, and media with blueprints to identify and confront that form of extremism. The national unity in rejecting violent white nationalist ideologues like James Fields, getting their names again, like these losers, are emblematic of America's resolve against the far right. The unanimous rejection of the El Paso shooter's beliefs, including President Trump, once more demonstrated the nation's resolve against hard right hate. Yet when it comes to far-left violent extremism, there is a gaping blind spot in the mainstream discourse, and we are less safe because of it. And this is very, very true. Beyond banal condemnations of violence, politicians and leaders must work to uproot far-left militant beliefs from mainstream politics. The Dayton shooter promoted the same virulently anti-law enforcement rhetoric, and too many mainstream figures on the left flirt with. And yet it was courageous police officers who finally ended his carnage when they shot and killed him outside the Ned Pepper's bar in Dayton's entertainment district. His case also makes clear that Antifa's violence goes far beyond the street hooliganism it has become infamous for. The group espouses the belief that liberal democracy is irredeemably oppressive, fascistic even, and may be thoroughly destroyed. Hence, acts of extreme violence against individuals, property, and the state are seen as stepping stones, bringing us closer to the collapse of society and a new, more just societal order. As anyone familiar with the 20th century history knows, apocalyptic ideas of this kind won't stop with street thuggery. Last month, an Antifa militant firebombed an immigration and custom enforcement facility in Tacoma, Washington. Police say Willem van Sprassen was killed after he aimed a rifle at them during the attack. His gun had apparently malfunctioned before he could fire. In his manifesto, he called for his comrades to take up arms in confronting the ascendant fascism of the state. In one of the Dayton shooter's tweets before he extinguished the lives of 9 fellow Americans, he responded to a person asking if Van Sprassen had been a villain or martyr, and he flatly replied, martyr. So, that is just another example of Antifa terroristic violence. And by the way, there are plenty more. Like I said, this gentleman here, Andy Go, or however you pronounce his last name, let's just briefly get into him. We only have about 5 minutes, but we, of course, can look him up here. And notice, look at this, getting Andy Go and his fascist friends off our streets. And it's funny because the mainstream media loves to go after and attack people who decide, that they're going to go after Antifa. But nonetheless, that's not our point here. Andy Go responds to the media smear pieces. Why does he have to respond to media smear pieces? Because he was attacked, actually. And let's go ahead and actually listen to him real quick.
Tend to be brave dissidents to the powerful. Every single one of them sucks up. Washington, unfortunately, is brimming with fake journalists who pretend to be brave dissidents. All of them grovel to the powerful. Every single one of them sucks up. Andy No is not one of those. He is actually a journalist. And for his coverage of Antifa's activities in Portland, Oregon, he was doused at first with a milkshake, which is obviously an assault that we're supposed to laugh at, but it's not funny if you think about it. Later, he was put in the hospital with a brain hemorrhage. So if anyone deserves to be considered a victim of political violence, it's Andy No, because he was a victim of political violence. But in a new piece, Rolling Stone magazine argues that actually Antifa are the victims and No is responsible for, quote, demonizing them. Probably one of the dumbest, most repulsive articles I've seen in a long time. Andy No joins us tonight. What do you think of this piece, Andy?
Well, Tucker, part of what makes Antifa such a potent movement is that they can depend on their fellow travelers in the media to provide them consistent, favorable coverage. These same writers and journalists are trying to basically finish the job that Antifa started back in June when they beat and robbed me and tried to intimidate me permanently into silence.
I mean, they're not hiding it. Like, the woman who wrote this piece is endorsing violence. I mean, they're just kind of out of the closet in favor of political violence.
What's been fascinating and a bit surreal is to watch the whole machine of left-wing media work to amplify the claims of an anonymous Antifa activist who made the false and defamatory claims that I am party to a violent criminal conspiracy with right-wingers. It's absolutely untrue. It started originally on a left-wing blog and then was amplified in Media Matters, Rolling Stone, Daily Beast, so on and so forth.
Yeah, I mean, I hope the rest of us don't lie to ourselves about what's happening here, because it's getting increasingly obvious, and you're one of its first victims. Andy, No, I wish we had more time with you, but thank you very much for coming on. Appreciate it.
My pleasure.
Now, of course, a little bit awkward, but nonetheless, you see here, right, he's been demonized everywhere by people. And why is he being demonized by people? Because he had the audacity to get attacked. I know, crazy that have somebody might have the audacity to be the victim of an attack. Completely insane, right? And this is not where it all ends, right? Of course, we've gotten into a few times the violent political protests that went on at the second Unite the Right rally, but more importantly at the 2017 Berkeley riots, right? We, of course, have seen the rise of people in the media basically accepting this. In fact, we have seen a refusal from Representatives Ilhan Omar and Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez to condemn Antifa. In fact, there even seems to be a certain level of praise from them to Antifa. And you see this even from people like Mitt Romney, for crying out loud. So we're seeing more and more, they're getting more violent and more violent and more violent. And even to the point of where, you know, there is, it's only a conspiracy theory at this point. People have said that Devin Patrick Kelly and also the, is that his name, Devin Patrick Kelly? Pretty sure it is. Nonetheless, the shooter from the church in Fort Worth, Texas, or wherever it was in Texas, and the Las Vegas shooter, there's been allegings that they were Antifa members. I don't actually know whether or not that's true, so I'm not claiming that. However, with the way that the media likes to cover up what we have seen plainly in their violence, I don't think it would at all be surprising that these were instances of media covered up violence from Antifa. I certainly don't think it would at all be surprising. I also wouldn't be surprised if it was just evil people doing evil things. But nonetheless, we have a very serious problem with Antifa here. And it's not because they're the most violent group in the world. It's because they're the most powerful violent group in America. They're the most powerful violent group in America. Right? They have people in the media, people in Hollywood, people in big business, people at Wall Street, and people in the highest echelons of Washington's political structure who support them. They also have people in the smallest echelons of the local political structure who support them as well. So it's all the way up, right? They go from grassroots to the very top. And, well, maybe not the very top, obviously, right? Not the president. But certainly, like, Representative Ocasio-Cortez, Senator Chuck Schumer, and etc., they're definitely complicit in this. Senator Bernie Sanders definitely complicit in this. They've all said so themselves. And so I think we have a very big problem here. And I think we definitely need to watch out for it. Antifa, I think, is leading us to almost inevitable civil conflict, whether or not that's a full-fledged civil war or just regional violence. I guess we'll go ahead and see. But I definitely see violence between Antifa and right-wing groups and the government, all in a three-way fight with each other, coming up very soon. Whew! I gotta get off here. I'm done. I don't want to do this video anymore. So thank you guys very much for watching. You're obviously going to see all the articles and videos and stuff like that in the comment section down below, as well as links to our social media websites. If you'd like to like us there, and if you like the content that we have here and consistently like our content, we have the Watchdog, which we're going to be posting once a week on random days, weekdays, and Unapologetics, which is a religious apologetics program, which we're going to be posting on the weekends. You can tell the difference by the title and also the logo and also when they were posted. But nonetheless, you can, of course, subscribe here at TheCynicogue, like us at the American Cynic Party, like us on the TheCynicogue on Minds. The American Cynic Party is going to be on Facebook, ACP Official on Gab, Terrestrial Earthbird on Twitter, and Cynic Thought on Instagram as well. We would definitely appreciate any of that. Go ahead and throw any likes or dislikes on here and share if you did approve of this content. Any questions, comments, concerns, criticisms, and etc. go in the comment section below. Thank you very much for that. And, yeah, have a good rest of your day. Shalom.